Alright, me. So I'm in yet another random person's classroom. Shout out to Mrs. Krause. Um, Yesterday, I didn't bring the book with me today because there's no point in doing it, but yesterday I finished reading Jane Austen's Emma. Um, this book took me quite a while to read. Um, I started reading it at the end of the Little Mermaid production, and then it's now mid-April, so it took like 3 weeks to read that. Um, and a lot of it just comes down to the fact that it's a book that I've like tried to read. Like, I think this is my third time trying to read it, in which I tried to read it. The first time I read this was for a women literature class, and I got about 150 pages in or so, and then I was like, I can't do this anymore. I tried reading it at camp around the same time I read Sense and Sensibility. It was that same summer. And same deal, got about 150 pages in and then stopped. This time, same deal, I got about 150 pages in, stopped, didn't want to read. And then finally this week, I've had enough time in classrooms as a substitute teacher to be able to finish reading. So that's that, right? It's a book that it takes, for whatever reason, right? It just didn't work with me. And I think the best way to describe why that is like, it is a book that is so much focused on like this, really this book is structured like a mystery, right? The problem is you don't know that you're reading a mystery until the very end, right? And so, I mean, my version's about 460 something pages long, and you don't really understand how you should have been reading this book until you get to like page 360, and then you only got 100 pages left of like, oh, okay. Knowing that now, I think that this would be a more enjoyable read the second time after I've taken a break from it for a while. But yeah, right? Because it's one of those things of where like, you from the very beginning, you have this kind of vague sense of how this is gonna go, and you already have this kind of understanding of like, Emma's gonna end up with George Knightley at the end of this, and like that's gonna be that. But the way that we get there is so nonsensical, right? Because it's not like dominoes, right? Of where like it takes a long time to set everything up, but you see the logical chain of actions and reactions. You knock one down and you see that everything goes in line. It's more like playing Battleship, right? In which you're just firing randomly and constantly missing. You know what the outcome of the game is. You know how the game is won. You know what this all ends up looking like, right? But it's none of it really makes any sense until you outline all the boats, and then all of a sudden everything finishes and it's all there, it's all good, right? And then another huge part of the problem, I think, is that inherently I'm not someone who finds the minutia of social interactions very interesting to think about and to dissect, right? And that's what a huge portion of this book is, right? It is Emma, and it is Knightley, and it is Harriet, and Jane Fairfax, and it's this dissection constantly of these social situations and manners and how do they present themselves and all of this, and that's just not inherently interesting to me, right? Because going back to when I was reading Sense and Sensibility, right, I still had the same issue of that first half of where it felt like this drag, but it was at the halfway point in a much shorter book that we then get, okay, here's now the logical, here's how we get everything laid out to us. This, right, when 80% of the book is this, you're searching for clues about how people are interacting with each other and the manners that they present. And because of politeness and because of this sensibility, right, that you don't want to ever actually name drop anyone, then it causes a whole mess of confusion in things, right? So that's that, right? The book itself, right? There's a quote out there that's flying around that I used in my essay about this book, but it's by Jane Austen, and it basically says, you know, I wanted to create the most unlikable character that there is, and then make the reader like them, right? And Emma really is that sort of person, I think, right? Because Emma is so self-conceited, but also has no humbleness to her, right? But is also very passive when it comes to like actual issues unless pressed upon them, right? That's the reason why the relationship between her and Knightley is so important, and also the most interesting relationship in this whole book, is because it's like that the general topic and the general trope of like best friends that should be lovers but aren't, right? Because they inherently, right, they're the only ones that can counterbalance each other, right? Because they're the only people who are willing to see faults in the other, right? But yeah, so, right, really what's happening throughout the entire book, right, is that Emma Woodhouse is fighting this thing in which she really has feelings for Knightley but refuses to acknowledge them and doesn't want to acknowledge them. And in doing so, she kind of portrays herself as this person that's never going to marry and never going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, now the problem is, for women of her society at this point in time, right, they're inherently valued for the fact that they don't have to work, right? They're meant to be keepers of the house, not housekeepers, but keepers of the house and keepers of the estate, right? And so Emma runs into the situation of where if she thinks that she's never going to marry, right, then she has to be the keeper of the estate somewhere. And so she's doing it for her father, and she's the keeper of the estate for her father, but that time is running out, and everyone kind of knows it. And so Emma places herself and tries to find value in a different sort of way, and she tries to reinvent herself as a matchmaker, right? And Knightley from the very beginning is like, you may have suggested this, but like, this was an eventuality that was going to happen anyway, right? And so Emma takes it upon herself to try then create this new match and create this new person, which is when she takes in Harriet Smith, right? And what Emma ends up doing, right, Harriet Smith is from this very humble background. We learn at the very end she's like, you know, the daughter of a merchant, and Emma tries to place this huge amount of sensibility and class into Harriet, to then get Harriet married to someone who is higher up, right? And so Harriet is offered a proposal from a, you know, mid-level farmer in society, and Emma encourages the the refusal of that marriage, which then spirals into everything else, right? Because now we have a limited amount of resources available to Emma and to Harriet, in which the resources are eligible bachelors to be married, right? And then we get an abundance of resource in Frank Churchill that comes in, and he's like this very, very artsy type of guy, doesn't really have any sense to him. And so Emma really tries to place this whole thing of where, well, if Harriet has all of the sense and Churchill has all of the sensibility, then this should be a perfect match. That all falls apart because of Miss Jane Fairfax, as it turns out at the very, very end of this, right, is that Miss Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill have actually been engaged this entire time, right? But we just get leading up to that, right? It is just folly after folly after folly on Emma's part, right? Because Emma is trying so hard to prove herself to the world that she is worth more than just being a housekeeper, right, for someone's estate. But in the end, what ends up happening is all of Emma's actions mean literally nothing, right? This was going to play out whether Emma intervened or not, right? All she did was give more class and more style to Harriet Smith, and that was it, right? Because throughout all of these things of loves and proposals and flirtations and all of this, right, in the end, Emma gets married to Knightley, which was a foregone conclusion from the very start. Fairfax has already been engaged to Churchill for the entire time, so that was never going to change. And in fact, Emma almost ruined that. And then Harriet Smith gets married to, I don't remember his first name, but Martin, Mr. Martin, who was the farmer who proposed to her in the first place, right? And that was something that was probably going to happen anyway, right? And so what we see is all of Emma's actions have not actually done anything, right? The world would have played out the same whether or not Emma had actively intervened and tried to play matchmaker and tried to do these certain things, right? And so we have to ask ourselves the question, right? Is this Jane Austen just writing the story of here's the mishaps and follies of someone who is trying to go above what their station in life is? Or is this Jane Austen saying this is the reality of being a upper class woman at this time, in which your actions simply do not matter because they're overwritten or ignored by the people who hold power in society, right? Personally, I think that's the way more interesting way to look at this, right? But certainly I'm not Jane Austen, and I cannot guarantee that, right? Or guarantee that's the way that this was supposed to be read. The other thing that we focus on a lot here is the distinctions in class and upward momentum and things like that. And really, this is such a segmented part of society that there is no upwards movement whatsoever, right? It's always talked about how much of a stain it would be for people to marry below their value. So that happens a lot with Jane Fairfax at the end of, or not Jane, Harriet Smith at the end of where they're like, oh yeah, this was not going to be a good marriage because Harriet Harriet Smith is so far below economically compared to the other eligible bachelors in the area. But that's a lot of it for Emma, right? I understand why it is such a beloved book of Jane Austen, because now that I understand where we are going with this, I think I would appreciate a lot of the minutia scenes a lot more. But for someone who's not particularly interested in the dissection of manners and politeness and high class society, right? It's just not enjoyable for me. And the other part that's not really enjoyable for me is because of the society that we're looking at, right? We have all these things going on with the servants, right? The servants are hearing X, Y, and Z. The servants are meant to are passing secret messages. They're setting up secret meetings, and we don't get to see any of that, right? All interactions with the servants are blunt directions. There's no confiding. There's no rumors going amongst, the servants in any of the houses, any of the estates, right? Which I think would make this a way more interesting thing that and think that you to dissect, in which the upper class society thinks so little of lower class society that works for them, that they see no value in telling them secrets, right? Because if the servants tell anyone, then who's going to believe them? Or at least that's the imagination, right? And instead we just get brief mentions of servants doing X, Y, and Z, and I just don't think that is as fun as it could have been, right? But that's my thoughts on Emma by Jane Austen.